and properly welcome everyone to our weekly call. So welcome, thanks for joining for our call this week. Just by way of agenda, the main topic of conversation, we moved away from a sort of tech focus this week, more to a sort of policy focus, and it's really picking up on a topic which was on the sort of weekly news headlines about 3 weeks ago, give or take, which was about demands for mandatory DNS filtering. So the topic, as you'll see on the screen, is: are demands for mandatory DNS filtering a real cause for concern? That's, for example, demands by rights holders, state authorities, or potentially other parties that I haven't thought of. We have a mini panel of 3 volunteers, or volunteers in the sense that probably all 3 of them couldn't immediately think of a good excuse to say no. And those in alphabetical order are John Todd from Quad 9, Paul Vixie from AWS, and I emphasize AWS because I erroneously managed to mistype that as AMS in the call reminder. So Paul hasn't changed jobs recently, he's definitely at AWS, and Vittorio Bertola from Open-Xchange. And the plan is I'll ask each of the 3 of them to sort of share their immediate thoughts. That may lead to some discussion, but then we'll basically open it up to gather contributions from others and see where the conversation takes us. And if and I'll just keep an eye on the clock as we go along. So if I ask people if you could use the Zoom tool to raise your virtual hand or put any comments in the chat or questions as we go along, and then at an appropriate moment I'll then open it up the discussion to others than our sort of first 3 panelists for this discussion. So hopefully that all makes sense. So let me firstly switch off my screen sharing so you can see me. So that's the plan. I thought, as Paul was the person that responded to the news headline and suggested it might be an interesting discussion, Paul, I might ambush you and see if there's anything you wanted to say by way of opening comments, and then I'll go to John and then Vittorio, and then, as I say, we just let the conversation run for a bit and then open it up to others if that's okay. So
all good by me. So the affiliation you have ascribed to me is still wrong. I'm part of AWS Security, which is a different part of the company than AWS itself. Good. So with all possible respect to John and everyone else at Quad 9 and everyone who is running a public DNS system, because I know that the motives are pure, the hearts are pure. I have long questioned whether it is a net good and whether there are other ways to achieve the ends that these systems tend to achieve. And I'm on record. I'm not going to go through that. That would take hours. So instead, let me just give a story, which could be taken as a parable. Before the Internet Blackout Day, which was the thing that ended the US government's desire to control the DNS lookups of all ISPs on American dirt, there was a long period, years long, where people like myself, Steve Crocker, Dave Dagan, were talking to congressional leaders and their staffs, spending a lot of time inside the Beltway, as they call it, trying to say you can't do this. It was called SOPA, it was called Protect IP, it was had a number of different names. But what the answer we got when we said you can't do this was, we're the US government. What we say goes, not just here, but around the world. And we gave all kinds of reasons why you just can't do that. And, it's not that the internet is a collective consciousness that will rise up on its hind legs and gore you if you try to do it, although that's what it's going to look like. It's, disorganized rabble. But what you're trying to do is simply going to provoke a response that'll create operating conditions you like even less. And I gave to them the example of Italy, when the Italian government realized that there was a lot of online gambling that where the websites were not paying whatever gambling tax or license fee or whatever Italy wanted. And so they made a list of all the websites that were essentially keeping money from flowing to state coffers. And they made the demand to their ISPs. We really want you to, in fact, we insist that you do not allow connections to these places. And I think everyone on this call is aware that if what you have is a domain name, you can't necessarily stop the connection because by the time the connection is occurring, it might be quite opaque. And it might be, all you know is the IP address, and that could be shared with millions of non-gambling sites. In other words, the Italian government had no idea what they were asking for, but the way it was interpreted was, let's block these in the DNS. And on the appointed day, switches were thrown, things were blocked, and 8.8.8.8 got overnight several million new users from Italy. And I told this story to congressional leaders during the SOPA battle so that I could say, you can't do this. What you're trying to do won't work. The internet has almost laws of physics that prevent what you're doing from working. And what they said is, we are a nation state, and we will do what we think is in the best interests of those who sent us here and those who keep us here. And the internet is just going to have to get along. Now, this ended fortuitously in a way and badly in another, because the internet blackout day was so effective and so many powerful people called their congressman or their senator and said, you got to stop this, that essentially all of the support for SOPA went away because of the internet blackout day. And that was good because that was the outcome we wanted, but it was also bad because we didn't get a chance to litigate it and figure out what are the limits of a nation state. However, in the time since then, we've seen plenty of other examples. In the UK, a lot of ISPs subscribe to something from the Internet Watch Foundation that makes CSAM less accessible to customers of those ISPs, and once again encourages people who want to see that kind of thing or just don't want their arm twisted to use, John Todd's system or Google's system, or use something that won't have that filtering. Let me just assure you that nation states really believe that they have a right to exist and that they must be able to control the flow of value inside their economies. And they're not going to say at any time, the internet is too big for us, we have to get along, and that's not going to happen. So what we're seeing right now, I guess in Germany, Quad 9 is being required to block something, and it's causing quite a stir. That's the tip of a mighty iceberg. And I know a lot of people in the free culture movement really want to see the end of nation states. They want the end of the national era, the beginning of something else that's maybe more meritorious and less based on how many jet planes and missiles you can mobilize. Nation states are not going to go quietly. So what we're seeing is a natural outgrowth of things that allow nation state powers to be bypassed. And so to the extent that there are 200 or so reachable x.x.x.x, and by the way, AWS acquired Net3 a while ago, so we could actually make 3.3.3.3 if we had a mind to, but there are about 200 others. And eventually, because this is an attractive thing to do for a lot of reasons, I expect to see every possible X.X.X.X in use. I expect a lot of them will be nation states in disguise trying to collect traffic. I expect that the practice of sending your most sensitive, personally identifiable information, that is to say, your IP address at the moment, and a question which has a domain name which indicates your intent. So the combination of identity and intent is being sent to non-contracted parties who are not necessarily in the same legal regime as you. They may not have the responsibility to protect your rights that someone in your legal regime would have. And it's going to continue to provoke nation states to actions like these. And let me just close by saying what we really need to do is to make it easier for people to run their own DNS servers. We might need a DNS ring to sort of mix up the traffic so you can't associate questions with later sessions, but we need to do something that is firmly in the hands of users who can decide for themselves whether they want to follow national law or not, and we'll make that decision whether we make it possible or not. We should make it possible. Those are my remarks. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. John, do you want to follow that?
Sure. So first, I'll actually answer the question that you posed more directly, and the answer is that a cause for concern that filtering or censorship is occurring in the DNS? And the answer is yes. So to get right out in the front and say yes, but actually, Paul's raised actually a huge number of good points, and I'll address a couple of those just because I wrote some notes while he was chatting. The fact that open resolvers exist is kind of irrelevant to this argument. We happen to be the tip of the spear because open resolvers are the largest place where people can go and say, I want to enforce this policy against what people can see or what sites they can go to. We happen to be the easiest target, but we are not the end of the game, right? Anybody can set up a recursive resolver. If a nation state decides that they want to filter what their end users are doing or seeing, whether it's for copyright or for CSAM or for any kind of criminal enterprise or for censorship of ideas, they are going to go to as far down that stack as they can. They're going to pursue that. And so it's right now, today, the open resolvers are the question, but that's not the end of the calculation. And that raises the question of what is the DNS and where does censorship occur? Again, open recursive resolvers seem like an interesting first place to go, but ultimately you have to start looking at the authoritative resolvers and what is allowed to communicate with authoritative resolvers. And if we create some kind of model, which by the way, I would be very interested in. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Authoritatives are not resolvers.
Okay. Sorry, I tripped over that again. So authoritative servers, is that more appropriate, are going to be the target ultimately where this type of censorship occurs, because the recursive side of things is not going to be sufficient to solve this problem. I'm very interested if there's some model that creates a way that people can anonymously attach to and authoritaves. And in fact, that's underway right now, and I'm very interested and excited to see that happening. But this is not the end goal. So that raises the question. Another question is, regimes. What legal regime are you in? What is the jurisdiction that you're in? That becomes a very, very difficult problem to get around. In Quad 9's case in Germany, as an example, the most recent ruling or the most recent court authorship that came back, there were discussions about how there was a VPN used to access the site in question. Meaning that there were essentially, it appears that there were essentially intentional methods of getting around any jurisdictional level blocking that we might have implemented for Germany by using a VPN. And that was used as an example of, well, you're still resolving the domain. A user in Germany using a VPN was able to resolve the domain. Well, of course, right? You're using a VPN, you're intentionally circumventing jurisdictional issues. So that's another large question of what does the jurisdiction mean in these equations. Very often, of course, the internet does not follow national rules. You connect to a server that's not necessarily in your country to resolve something, even though there is a server in your country. Is that intentional, not intentional? Then does the intention of the ISP become added to this play? Like, can you not resolve or can you not route certain IP addresses outside of your borders? As Paul said, the internet has these kind of rules of physics which don't allow these blocks to happen or don't allow this type of behavior to work for a long period of time. I've had a number of discussions with, because Quad 9 is kind of the end of the spear right now, with other national authorities on what they would like to do or what they'd like to see, some of which involve, as an example, equipment that is accessing unauthorized content. The equipment manufacturers in these cases, they're whether those are software or hardware, they're going to get more clever as soon as something like blocking occurs on recursive resolvers, even if it is universally mandated to recursive resolvers within a nation. The people that are trying to circumvent this are just going to come up with better ways of doing it, and that's going to be almost instantaneous. It's not going to be the long cat and mouse game. It's going to take a matter of days for systems to circumvent the DNS and come up with some more clever way of getting around these issues. So, and that gets back to kind of a longer point I wanted to make, is that yes, the DNS is a place where people are looking to implement filtering. It is a terrible place to implement filtering that is against the end user's designs. And we still believe, and Quad 9 does actually, I think, a pretty good job at this, if the end user agrees with your intentions for certain filtering. We block malware as an example. If the end user's goals are in line with the service that they're using, they'll continue to use it, and it will be actually fairly effective. As soon as there becomes a disjoint in the intention of the end user and the operator of the recursive resolver or the operator of the service in general, then you're going to see users, of course, switch to something else. In Paul's example, users in Italy move to Quad 8, and we're going to see the same thing if there's kind of blocking or there's a distrust of the recursive infrastructure, then end users are going to go to something else. So I think that the intent is good. We do certainly believe that copyright holders, intellectual property holders have a right to receive compensation for their work. We simply think that the DNS is there's a wrong place to do it. It's a terrible place to do this type of blocking. And it's going to ultimately result in worse outcomes for everyone involved. So I'll pass it to the next one, Vittorio.
Perfect, thanks. Just before Vittorio picks up, I can see, Chris, you've got your hand raised. Is that a quick clarification question, or are you simply first in the mic queue for when we open up?
Oh boy, it might have been first in queue, so I can hold it until later.
Perfect. Okay, that's grand. In which case, Vittorio, do you want to give your perspective?
Yes, thank you. So I will briefly go through, what could be the concerns and what should be the concerns in my personal view.
Yeah.
So, of course, when you have this discussion, the first concerns that everyone is raising are the philosophical ones, like about fragmentation and censorship. And in a way, at least from a European standpoint, the censorship argument is a losing one in Europe, meaning that, at least here, the filtering, the state-based filtering is not used to block any political content, let's say. Maybe one could discuss on like terrorism but it's a moonshot to define that, political content. But most of it is aimed at illegal gambling or CSAM or whatever. So actually, when people start to tell our policymakers that you are censoring the internet, there's not a good reaction to that. When they won't buy into that. So the argument is more about fragmentation, but in general, also the national fragmentation of the internet, which is just one of many forms of internet fragmentation, is here to stay. So I don't think this will be a battle that you can win by arguing that everything should be completely global. It never was. So, I would like to continue Paul's story on how Italy is a precursor. So I have some kind of direct experience in state-mandated filtering. It is one of the countries in Europe that has the longest list of filtered domains, even if I think have some. So, I mean, it was like 20 years ago. So at the time when this started in Italy, we actually fought as the Italian internet community to have this implemented at the DNS level, because the alternative would be have it implemented at the IP address level. So we have firewall and blocking, and that would have been much worse. So in a way, of course, we tried to argue that you should not block stuff, and I mean, we used the same arguments that were used in the US against those other laws. But when it was clear that this would not go away because the political pressure was just too strong, then at least we thought that DNS is the best compromise that you can have. Because I mean, yes, it's not 100% effective, but this is actually a feature, not a bug. It's a sort of self-defense against real censorship, so the real misuse of this system. And yes, it's not totally effective, and if possible, you should take content down, or maybe block the domain, remove the domain at the authoritative level. But if this is a foreign domain, and maybe for Italy, this is a stronger problem than it is for Germany or the US, I mean, then you really have no other choice. So while you wait to do the international law procedure and get this taken down at the source, at least you start blocking it. And so I agree, this is sort of a terrible place to implement filtering, but it's the less terrible we have. So this is not going to go away. So, I mean, the strategy of thinking, well, let's continue arguing and it will go away, I think it's a losing strategy. And the facts are that it's getting worse. And I mean, it's getting more frequent and not less frequent. So I'd rather go into what are the concerns for someone that actually has to try to make this work, even if not liking it. So I'd say there are two types of concerns. The first ones are legal. So I think that the legal concerns that any resolver, I mean, both global and national, has when this kind of filtering are mostly due to the uncertainty. So the fact that this is has been going on without any kind of real agreement on how it should work, and both at the legal, from the legal standpoint and from the technical standpoint. So, I mean, what happened to Quad 9 is unbearable because it gives us individual rights holders a way to act against specific resolver operators. And so to choose which ones to target and which ones not to target, and to tilt the market, and so this is really not how it should be. And even like this, I mean, the VPN example that, I mean, like also arguing that if people can still access you via VPN, then you're not blocking the domain, is exactly another sign that this uncertainty is still creating problems. So you cannot solve this issue and be completely sure of what you are liable for if you don't solve the legal uncertainty and you don't get to a framework which is, at least at the European scale, generally agreed on how this should work. And then, of course, there are the competition concerns. So this has been a constant argument by Italian ISPs and resolver operators. Like, I mean, we have to implement these filtering lists, and there's a cost, there's a burden, there's a liability. At the same time, people just move to Google and they go wherever they want to go. And so, I mean, by the way, I mean, this is, I mean, yes, I'm sure that there were many people, including myself at times, trying to use Google to bypass certain kind of blocks. At the same time, if you go to Geoff Houston's stats, I mean, I just went, still apparently in Italy, 93% of users are using Italian resolvers. So that's a specific effect maybe for a few people that really want to get to this kind of blocked content. But it's not like a mass migration of users outside of the country. But still, there is this competition concern. And the answer in general is you should just force the global resolvers to follow our own same rules. And it's hard to say why this not should be. I mean, except that I understand that if you're a global resolver, then you have to implement the different filtering lists for 200 countries, and it's going to be a problem. But then we have to discuss that problem maybe and not others. And so, but yeah, I mean, this is not going to go away. And I have another story from 2 years ago this time. So 2 years ago, I was involved in a public consultation by the Italian government, because I mean, the current law says in Italy, I mean, it was passed like 3 years ago, they were trying to implement this, says that when you buy any internet connection from an ISP, it must come with parental controls enabled. So all sites that are domains that are not suitable for children should be blocked by default, and then you can call the ISP and get the filters removed. So they were trying to write down the technical rules. I mean, this was the minister was trying to write down the rules on how to implement this, and they came up with something like, oh, but to prevent circumvention, all ISPs have to block Quad 8 at the IP address level, and all the other global resolvers. And if the people, I mean, if browsers attempt to DOH, they should try to block the download of the browsers. So this is really the mindset of regulators sometimes, especially in countries like Italy. So of course, we succeeded in convincing them that this was not the way to go. And basically they went back and I mean, I didn't never hear back from them. So we don't know if this law will ever be implemented. But at the same time, I mean, you can take this as a proof that, I mean, in both directions. So you can take this as a proof of the fact that it will never happen because technically it will entail too much. Or you could take it as a proof that sooner or later, I mean, someone will actually start to block by IP address quad 8, and if they don't comply with this. And whichever, I mean, which of the two, I have no idea. So the final set of concerns that I would like to raise are the ones about user experience, because we tend to forget about this. We tend to argue about, you know, from the technical side, the architecture of the internet and how the DNS should work. But we tend to forget that this is a terrible user experience for users, because they try to get to a website, they click on a link or whatever. And then, I mean, with HTTPS, with encrypted connection just hangs. I mean, they never get anywhere and they don't get any understandable error message. And there are things that we could do about that. And there are efforts at the IETF going on. And of course, the problem is, again, that there's a part of the industry, especially the browsers, that is not really cooperating on this because, again, of the principal reasons that we saw in the beginning. And I mean, of course, everyone is entitled to their principles and also to their views and interests and whatever is motivating them. But at the same time, if we continue not addressing this, we will just doing a bad favor to users. I mean, putting them in front of user experiences that are terrible, while we could try at least to make them a little better. And this could be like a sort of potentially low-hanging fruit that we could try to reach, at least to make things slightly better.
Brilliant. Thank you, Vittorio. So 3 quite different points of view, which is excellent. Makes it far. I think just gets across the point that this is not as simple an issue as it first seems. So, is it really, if you like, the nation states sort of potentially flexing their muscles? But at the same time, should citizens be able to run their own resolvers, make their own choices, which I think were 2 of the points that Paul covered. Equally, should it be down to the authoritative servers, or are the authoritative servers rather the more appropriate place if you had such designs to do this, rather than recursives? And then you got the whole question about what jurisdiction applies, etc., etc. Some just 2 of the points that the sort of John brought up. He certainly wasn't advocating for doing it at authoritative servers, but just, I think, suggesting that was logical if you were doing that sort of thing. And is it really just another aspect of fragmentation and censorship? The ongoing debate, as Vittorio highlighted, and is DNS filtering the least worst of the available choices? And even if it is, can we do something about the not ideal user experience? So that's merely a handful of the many sort of excellent points that came up. So Chris was first to the mic, so I think we should give Chris the sort of option to come back in again now, should you wish to, Chris, and then others, if you want to sort of either pose questions or comments, please sort of raise your virtual hand or put things in the chat, and I'll come to those as well. But Chris first, if you wish, still, over to you.
John and I have been having some exchanges one-on-one in Zoom, so I've cleared up some things, but I wanted to ask, I guess, a question to the people who did speak or shared their remarks, rather. Where or how viable do you all think filtering on the clients is as a potential future direction? Like there's you can filter in the DNS, it has pros and cons. You could filter at the actual connection layer itself by looking at the TLS SNI, has pros and cons. You can terminate TLS and start looking at the plain text and filtering there. And Peter asked a helpful clarifying question whether or not this is mandatory or not. Let's go with mandatory right now, because like the non-mandatory case, I have opinions about. I don't want to get into that though. But I'm curious, like based on your experiences and working with different client populations, different sort of maybe enterprise scenarios or that have different BYOD policies and whatnot. Like from a technical perspective, how viable would it be to like just push some of this all the way down to the client, which is ultimately responsible for initiating connections? And as a kind of follow up or a shorter, hopefully part two to that question, do you actually think that would be useful for the purposes of like, let's say, implementing malware filtering or something like that? I could see it as a potentially useful option for filtering against like known domains or known sites or something for which you have a fixed list. But under the premise that malware can like change software and do smart things, the less certain that malware protection is reasonable. So anyways, I'm kind of just rambling, so I'll stop there, but very curious to hear your thoughts on the first question.
Brilliant. So only the three of you have a view. Paul, you want to come in on that?
So blocking things at the DNS in a way that is treated as a feature, not a bug, in other words, something the user desires and is aligned with, is a fairly old story. And yes, indeed, the set of things which ought to trigger some kind of DNS lie, white lie, does change. It changes at least every day, often every hour, and sometimes every minute. And there are technologies that are designed to permit policy synchronizations of this type of trigger in real time over large communities. So we should not let the fluidity of the problem tell us that we're digging in the wrong place. There are solutions to this. I think the more important question is, what, if anything, could be done to get nation states to give up on this kind of thing? Because if we can't get them to give up, it's going to turn out that they can make John Todd a criminal in some country where he refuses to block what they tell him to block. I don't think we want John Todd to not be able to fly through certain airports because of the work that he's doing, but I don't see a way out of that outcome unless somebody introduces new principles or new information.
Okay, thanks, Paul. John or Vittorio, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah. So to the fundamental question of whether the client is the right place to do this, philosophically, or not philosophically, I guess, kind of looking at a technical diagram, it's probably the only place where things can be effective, but you're never going to be able to do that at scale, I don't think, without some really draconian measures, meaning you're going to have to install certificates on the client's devices, and you're going to have laws that say that the government has the ability to do things on the client device, on any client device, whether it's a general purpose software device, or whether it's a television, or whether it's a refrigerator. That's a very difficult problem to solve. So yeah, I think that looking at it from a structural perspective, the endpoint is the place where you kind of need to do those type of filters. I don't think it's technically viable at any point in the future, especially in the world that we have today, where equipment is made in one place and shipped to another, and there are just too many jurisdictions for those equipment manufacturers to even think about. And then there's legal liabilities if you don't do it the right way, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't think it's viable to do it at the client level. The last comment is that, again, looking at the judgments so far in the case with Quad 9 in Germany, the structure that you're seeing in those decisions, it is easily, any technical person can look at those decisions and say, I see how this judgment with the DNS can be easily modified or used as a precedent, essentially, in looking at pushing things deeper into the client. So anybody that's doing antivirus, anybody that's doing browser block lists, they, from where you sit on the map, they look identical to what Quad 9 does. And so that, I think, is the end goal, as to how to push these kind of, or at least the rights holder environment, how to push these kind of blocks into other aspects of the technology stack. And that's very worrying, because that opens the door to a number of other both abuses as well as faults that are from my perspective at least, are very unappealing. So,
yeah.
I mean, very quickly, if I can add something, I will just point out that I think that filtering at DNS level is better and more feasible than filtering at a client level for a number of reasons, including that not all clients can actually run these filters. But what I wanted to point out is that exactly right now, the European Union is discussing a law proposal that would force all developers of instant messaging apps to do filtering at the client level within the app to block CSAM. Now, this particular proposal will not fly, I think. I mean, there's too many people opposing it, including Germany, which is the biggest government. But I mean, this gives you an idea that whether it's technically feasible or not, I mean, lawmakers might not care. And so this is indeed something that could happen in the future.
Yeah, and I guess we need to be cautious when we get into mandatory device filtering in terms of if a government can mandate that, has some challenging privacy implications versus a not 100% effective DNS filtering, but maybe we'll come on to that. Now, we've got 5 hands raised. I am keeping an eye on the time. So I think we'll close the queue after Chris. And we'll take them in order, and I'll ask you to be reasonably brief if you have comments or questions, so we can hopefully cover everyone in our allotted time. So Glenn is next. So Glenn, over to you.
Yeah, I'll be quick. I do want to make the observation that we tend to focus on the copyright issue versus there's a lot of other uses for these kind of filters. Some of them are stuff that people really like, things like, blocking really bad things from coming at our homes and our devices. So I did want to make the observation. It seems like we're moving, in a direction. Sometimes we talk a little bit about the old war, the Sopa Pipit era, which was very ISP focused. And as in response, as a technical community, we've done a lot of things where, we've implemented new protocols that really take the ISP out of the equation and instead push things more towards these operators who will centrally put their hand up and say, well, hey, don't even go to the ISP, send all your traffic directly through me, through some protocol or through some other means. Aren't we sort of in this debate and not offering solutions to some of these hard questions, sort of pushing the internet towards a centralization model? Because now you have a lot of centralized operators that'll put their hand up and say, well, hey, forget all the edge controls, just come to me, send all your traffic through me, and I'll take care of you, and I won't be subject to all those edge access filterings. And that seems to be intersecting with that other huge issue we have, which is centralization concerns around the internet. And I'm kind of curious what the panelists' thoughts on that are.
Fantastic. So we've got fragmentation, censorship, and centralization, and I think it's a valid observation, to be fair, Glenn. So any of Paul, Vittorio, or Don want to come in on centralization?
Fragmentation and centralization are both undesirable and both inevitable.
Yeah, well, I mean, Quad 9 exists for 2 reasons. One is to provide basically protection for end users, which is difficult to do. It's not impossible, certainly, but it's difficult to do for end users by themselves. So we centralize that function, and they use us because we give them a decent protection. Secondly, the privacy component that we provide is actually sort of a function of centralization itself, meaning you aggregate your queries amongst many others. There are ways to solve that at the edge if you're doing something like a distributed mesh, but again, not simple. So simplification of some of these protocols would certainly lead to a decentralization, making things easier. Sure, that would be great. That doesn't seem to be the path that technology is following, though.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, actually, this is what Apple is doing with private relay. I mean, have all your traffic and DNS go through us. So this is centralization, also a way to bypass local filters and other things. But at the other time, it is creating a place where it will be easier to apply filters or whatever if the company agrees with the government. So I'd prefer a model in which there are protocols and ways so that everybody can apply this decentrally.
Yeah. Okay, good question. Thank you for that, Glenn. hopefully we don't get too depressed as we go through this. Ross, you're next in the mic queue if you want to come in.
Thank you. So I have kind of a slightly different perspective on it. So one of the things that I noticed through the case in Germany, and due to some of my background, so for those, well, most of you probably aren't aware, I actually happen to also be a lawyer. So I've been through law school and practicing law and all that fun. And one of the things I've noticed through my time there, although I don't do that anymore, it was painfully obvious to me how little the people that are drawn to that industry, who also happen to fall very often into the lawmaking industry as well, understand technology. Almost intentionally ignorant they are to it. I mean, I think to the point of a guy that I practiced law with, who he and I were same age, went to the same college, and one day I assisted him by showing him how he could do formulas in Excel, and he was baffled, absolutely amazed by that capability. And I think about the judges and some of the stuff with the case in Germany, to where at least some of the way that the stuff was written, it still made me believe that the judge or whoever was making the decision in Germany had some concept that the DNS resolution involved the transit traffic, as though they don't understand the fact that the resolution and the application traffic are not necessarily following the same path. And so should we be educating those in the legal industry about how technology works at a more fundamental level to try to help alleviate them trying to push these technically infeasible solutions? That's kind of my thought, and I'd love to hear what you guys think on that.
Yeah, so do we need to educate lawyers and politicians?
Yeah, basically, yeah.
Yeah, fantastic. Any thoughts?
That would be great if you have the budget.
I have educated a lot of lawyers, including a lot of the lawyers that sit on congressional staffs. They are never interested in constraints. They are interested in opportunities. So it's good for them to know, but that will not stop them from taking on work that involves pushing for these things.
Yeah, I guess it's the populist argument as well, which probably applies to things well beyond the internet, to be fair. Okay, another great sort of question, good issue to raise. Paul, you're next in the queue, Paul. Sorry, Peter. I'm looking at Peter and saying Paul. Paul's not in the queue. Peter definitely is.
Peter and Paul on the same call. So yeah, it's funny how often we get mixed up. Our names get mixed up. I think this comes down to trust in the government, or trust in the organization which is handling the filter list. So my question is, I think that it can be done well if it's a trusted organization which manages the block list. But also I think that there's a big difference between mandatory filtering and like defaulting to filtering. So having the filtering enabled and switched on for most people, but at some way to bypass it. So you're legally allowed to visit domains which aren't on the DNS block list. But so my question to the people here is, what about a situation where the organization which is managing the filter list isn't part of the government? So it's an independent group, like with the Internet Watch Foundation, for example.
So, yeah, does that make it better, worse? Does that alleviate some of the concerns? I guess, again, thoughts on that from any of our...
I don't think it structurally changes the issue. You might have a higher trust in that list, but you still have a mandatory requirement. I think you mixed a couple of things in there, whether it's mandatory or not, like is there some way to get around it? When we're talking about filtering lists, they're going to be mandatory, and they're not going to be, there's not going to be an option to choose to follow them or not. And so I think that it would be useful, well, in the best of the worst, right? I think that it would be useful to have a third party that's responsible for those lists. That is, they still need to be imbued by the government with the authority to do that. And that's, you're basically just it's transitory responsibility, and it doesn't really change the equation much as far as I'm concerned.
Well,
And the worst thing is if you have multiples of them. Now, let's say you have 5 of them in any particular nation. Now we, at least from Quad 9's perspective, or any recursive in that jurisdiction, now we have to follow 5 different lists. It would be better if there was just one, and that's operated by the government, and they are the ones to do things. And because right now, again, in Germany, it's opening up the doors to any rights holder to tell us to block any site, and we have to disprove their assertion, which is crazy. So that's the worst possible case that we're in right now. But even the government creating that list would be a slight step up.
Okay, we haven't got much time left. I'd love to keep talking about it, but I don't want to use up all the time. So thank you.
As a governance model, consider the Google Safe Browsing project, which is enough trusted that even some non-Google browsers subscribe to it by default. This can be done in a way that's transparent and community accessible and not government mandated. But this call is about the government mandates and what kinds of operating condition changes those mandates are going to drive.
Okay, we're conscious of the time. Let's give as Chris has dropped off the mic queue, which is fine. Let's go to Arno for the last comment or question. If I could ask you to be reasonably brief, Arno, so that and I'll come to Vittorio first in case you have an opinion on it, Vittorio, before going to John and Paul for their final comments. So Arno.
Yeah. So just to be very brief here, there are a few things that a bit shocked me when I heard some of the things here, like some parties would like to eliminate nation states. I mean, boy, I'm working, spend most of my time in the ITU, and I'm facing administrations all the time. I mean, I think we can dream a dreamer, but there are plenty of things that will never fly, right? So rather than dreaming a dreamer, I'm a pragmatist. Back to the question, is there a possibility to put things on the endpoint? The answer is no. It's simply no. I mean, look at just a small organization, just even a company of 400,000 users, if you want to make it very big. It's already very hard, close to impossible to get things correctly done on the endpoint. You've got a stack of a stack of a stack of agents and all sorts of measures that is making like very costly and very difficult for organizations to do anything on the endpoint. So at the moment, I'm a very simple pragmatist guy that is trying to get things done in the places where we can. That's it. So if the DNS is the only place, well, let's do this. Yes, one place, or network security is one place. Let's do it where we can. That's all what we can do. The reason why I have this emergency problem is because from a security point of view, sometimes you don't have a choice. You must stop the ransomware, you must stop certain things, you must stop an access, and you don't have too many minutes to think about what you're going to do. But certainly not the endpoint is today just, I can imagine why some people would dream is the right direction, but it's just impractical. Yeah. There are plenty of other things I would have liked to say, like where to get us an exit from all of that, but I think we have an issue of the method of work and on the design approach we take, where we most of the time concentrate on technology and law, and we forget 2 other dimensions in the problem. But that will be for another time.
Okay, thank you for that. And you're right, this is complex. And I note a clarification in the chat from Chris that he was asking if it was technically feasible to implement on the endpoint, not whether it was easy. But anyway, that's just as a clarification. Right, let's go starting with Vittorio. If you want to comment on any of what either Arno just said, or indeed any other comments on anything else, just by way of closing. So Vittorio, we did reverse order. So we do Vittorio, then John, and finally Paul.
Well, first of all, I owe a note to Chris Wood. I mean, as he rightfully points out, private relay is not bypassing filters, but my point was more general, like that if we move to a situation, an architecture in which mean, the mobile OS maker, for example, centralizes the traffic, and then we only have 2 mobile OS makers. Potentially, that's, I mean, maybe an easy way to implement filters, but also an easy way to implement control. So, I mean, this is also an answer to the, I mean, let's do it on the client. I mean, as I said before, I'm actually happy that the current European proposal is not flying. I think that's, I mean, it's even worse to have clients, I mean, scrutinize all your traffic. But at the same time, that's a direction that the world is taking, and it's troublesome. So, I mean, in general, as I say, I mean, I am also a pragmatist, and so independently from the fact that I may like or not the fact that certain content is accessible or not, I mean, I think we should focus on reality and try to make things work as well as possible, and stop arguing on principal issues that are, I mean, in a way, some of these principal battles, at least in this part of the world, were sort of lost 20 years ago, and they are not. I mean, and I don't see the world getting back to the idea of a global borderless internet of complete free expression. Actually, everything that's been happening in the last 10 years has been pushing for more control, more laws, more rules, and more national sovereignty. So I think we should rather work by having that assumption in mind.
Okay, so digital sovereignty. Okay, thanks, Vittorio. John, any final comments?
I guess I'll restate the fact that from a copyright perspective and from a rights holder perspective, we fully respect those folks' ability to profit from their works. We simply don't see the DNS as an effective place to enforce that constraint. And in fact, enforcing it through the DNS will be counterproductive in the long term. And also to Vittorio's comments earlier about the fact that there are multiple questions here that are not being addressed. And we've talked about it on this call before, that nobody wants to be the first mover in a structure that allows more challenging issues to occur. In other words, censorship is what we see as a potential risk in the long term. We see copyright protection as a short-term risk, which is well-defined legally in some structures. But no one wants to take the first step in creating a model that allows for true censorship to occur. So we're stuck in everybody, pointing at everybody else and waiting for the first move to happen, whether that's the national governments to create, or in Europe in particular, to create a model that works across borders, or whether it's the service providers to create a structure that amongst themselves with an agreement. Nobody's willing to take that first move because it's a very dangerous and slippery slope to some very bad outcomes. So here we are, stuck having this call every 6 months or something like it, until somebody takes the first step.
Yeah, thanks for John. And last but not least, Paul, closing comments, the final comment to you.
Something I said when I was in the SOPA fight was, the country who best exemplifies the principles of SOPA is China. Are you sure you want to follow their lead? And that got more attention, frankly, than anything I'd said about the technical difficulties. But listen, everybody on this call is capable of thinking hard about these problems and coming up with proposed solutions, or even piloting some solutions. And as you do so, I hope that you will do as I have done in my fight against uncontrolled DOH, for example, which is to reason from inevitabilities, figure out what the parties involved are going to do, so that you know that your move, the move that you make in the great game, will not be the last one, and reason backward from those inevitabilities into something that could potentially reach an equilibrium rather than just more pushback. Thank you.
Yeah, good final observation about every action has an equal and opposite reaction. And China. So good to get China mentioned at the end. I thought that may have come up earlier, but yes, new IP, etc. Maybe that's an issue for another day. Right. Okay. Well, thank you, Paul, John, and Vittorio, for sort of kicking off the discussion. Thank you for the sort of thoughtful comments from you and everybody else. There's some really good comments in the chat, which I will include. I'll edit it lightly if it's not intended for wider sharing, but I'll put the majority of the chat I'll incorporate when I send out the link to the recording. So you've got that to peruse at your leisure, as we haven't got time to go through that now. We are over time, but I just briefly wanted to cover a couple of other things, but I will do it very briefly as we're just timing out. So and I'm not going to go through these in depth, but just to highlight that in case you missed it, Firefox 1.14 is a sort of the way it supports DOE has been tweaked. If I've understood it correctly, it now is default on, but in a light touch way. So you have to proactively disable it, which I'm not sure if that varies by territory, because outside of North America previously it wasn't default on. So I need to sort of look at that in more detail, but I just wanted to flag that there have been some changes in the way that DOE is supported in Firefox. Of the other things, you can read through those at your leisure. I will highlight, though, as I think you saw on the call, that Russ has just put out a paper on DNS spoofing and hijacking. So, as Russ is, say what he said he was, I don't know if he's still on the call. I thought that should be mentioned. So, take a look at that when you have a moment. Of all the other things, the other thing on that side I'll highlight, as a trustee of the IWF, it will be remiss of me not to mention that the IWF's annual report was issued last week, so please take a look at that, see where all the CSAM content is currently hosted, as well as a whole bunch of other stuff. And then finally, just to remind you, if you want to put forward any proposals for sessions at the Internet Governance Forum, the deadline is this week, the 19th, and also any BOF proposals for ITF 117, the deadline's coming up, it's the 26th, so you've got a couple of weeks for BOF proposals, but you've only got to the end of this week for IGF session proposals. So do bear that in mind. And then next week, the team from Echo will be on this call talking about top DNS. So that's their initiative on DNS abuse, just so you're aware of that. But in the interest of time, that's it from me. So thank you, everyone. Thanks in particular to Paul, John, and Vittorio. I hope that was useful. It's certainly thought-provoking for me. Maybe as we've only really scratched the surface of a topic, maybe it's a topic we need to come back to again and drill down, cover some of the other aspects, because there's an awful lot there to be unpacked, and maybe also pick up some of the stuff from the chat as well to make sure we do justice to that. But in the meantime, thank you everyone for your time. Have a fantastic week, and I'll send out a link to the recording shortly. So enjoy. Thanks everyone.
Thanks for the opportunity, Andrew.
Thank you.